The dust from the cattle drive still clung to Jake Morrison's boots as he stepped onto the wooden planks of Willow Creek's main street. The October sun hung low over the Colorado Territory, casting long shadows between the weathered buildings that made up their small frontier town. After 3 months on the trail, all Jake wanted was a hot bath, a decent meal, and maybe a drink at Murphy's saloon. Instead, he found his father waiting on the porch of their ranch house with a telegram in his weathered hands and a stern expression that meant trouble. "Jake, we need to talk," Samuel Morrison called out, folding the yellow paper carefully. At 62, the elder Morrison still cut an imposing figure, his grey beard neatly trimmed and his blue eyes sharp as winter ice. Jake dismounted his horse, a chestnut mare named Copper, and handed the reins to Tommy, their youngest ranch hand. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, with freckles scattered across his sunburned nose and an eagerness that reminded Jake of himself at that age. "Let me guess," Jake said, climbing the porch steps. "Another letter from the bank about the mortgage." Samuel shook his head, his expression growing more serious. "Worse, it's from the Weatherby family in Denver. They're calling in old debts, son. Your grandfather borrowed heavily from old Marcus Weatherby to start this ranch 40 years ago. Now Marcus is dead, and his son Charles wants payment in full." Jake felt his stomach drop. The Morrison ranch had been struggling since the harsh winter of 1886 killed nearly half their cattle. They'd managed to rebuild their herd, but barely broke even most years. "How much are we talking about?" $5,000 plus interest. Total comes to near $8,000. Samuel's voice was steady, but Jake could see the worry lines deepening around his eyes. "We don't have it, Jake. Not even close." The weight of responsibility settled on Jake's shoulders like a lead blanket. At 28, he'd been running the day-to-day operations of the ranch for 5 years, ever since his father's leg was crushed in a horse accident. The ranch employed 12 men year-round, and their families depended on the Morrison spread for their livelihood. "There might be another way," Samuel continued, unfolding the telegram again. "Charles Weatherby has a daughter, Victoria. She's 24, educated back east, and according to this, she's looking for a suitable husband. Charles is willing to forgive the entire debt if you marry her." Jake stared at his father, certain he'd misheard. "You want me to marry a complete stranger to save the ranch?" "I want you to consider all our options," Samuel replied. "The wedding would be in Denver, 6 weeks from now. You'd live there for the first year, help Charles expand his shipping business. After that, you could bring her back here if she's willing." The screen door creaked open, and Maria Santos stepped onto the porch carrying a tray of coffee. She'd been their housekeeper for 15 years, ever since Jake's mother died of pneumonia. In her 40s, with streaks of grey in her dark hair and kind brown eyes, Maria had become like family to them. "Perdón," she said in her soft Mexican accent, setting the tray on the small table between the rocking chairs. "I could not help but hear. This is about the debt, no?" Samuel nodded grimly. "Maria, you've been with us long enough to know the situation. If we lose this ranch, we all lose everything." Maria poured coffee into 2 tin cups, her movements careful and deliberate. She'd come north from Sonora with her late husband 15 years ago, seeking better opportunities. When he died in a mining accident, the Morrisons had taken her in, and she'd been loyal ever since. "In my village," she said quietly, "we have a saying, el corazón no se puede forzar. The heart cannot be forced. Marriage without love, it is like a tree without roots. It may stand for a time, but the first strong wind will knock it down." Jake appreciated Maria's wisdom, but the reality of their situation was inescapable. "What happens if I refuse? How long do we have?" Samuel consulted the telegram again. "Charles wants an answer by the end of November. If you decline, he expects full payment by New Year's Day. After that, he'll foreclose." The 3 of them sat in heavy silence, watching the sun sink lower toward the mountains. In the distance, Jake could hear the cattle lowing in the evening pasture and the sound of the ranch hands finishing their daily chores. This land had been his whole life, his family's legacy. The thought of losing it made his chest tight with panic. "I need time to think," Jake finally said, standing up and adjusting his hat. "I'm going into town." "Don't wait up!" As he walked toward Willow Creek's main street, Jake's mind raced with possibilities, each one seeming worse than the last. He could try to get a loan from another bank, but his credit wasn't good enough for that kind of money. He could sell off part of the land, but that would mean laying off workers and reducing their cattle operation to the point where it might not be profitable at all. The marriage proposal from Charles Weatherby wasn't just an offer. It was blackmail dressed up in social respectability. But if it meant saving the ranch and keeping 12 families employed, could he really afford to say no? Murphy's saloon buzzed with its usual evening crowd of cowboys, miners, and traveling merchants. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of whiskey, while a weathered piano player named Old Pete plunked out familiar tunes in the corner. Jake pushed through the batwing doors, his spurs jingling against the wooden floor as he made his way to the bar. "Well, if it isn't Jake Morrison," called out Murphy himself, a burly Irishman with arms like tree trunks and a red beard that reached his chest. "Heard you just got back from the drive. How'd it go?" "Good enough," Jake replied, though his mind was elsewhere. "Whiskey neat." Murphy poured the amber liquid into a shot glass and slid it across the scarred wooden bar. "You look like a man with troubles, Jake. Want to talk about it?" Before Jake could answer, a woman's laughter caught his attention. He turned toward the sound and saw her for the first time. A young woman with auburn hair pinned up in an elegant style, wearing an emerald green dress that was finer than anything typically seen in Willow Creek. She was dealing cards at one of the poker tables, her movements graceful and confident as she bantered with the players. "That's Rose," Murphy said, following Jake's gaze. "Rose Henderson. She arrived on the stage last week from San Francisco. Says she's looking for work, and Lord knows we needed someone who could deal cards properly and keep the customers happy without causing too much trouble." Jake watched as Rose deftly shuffled the deck, her green eyes sparkling with intelligence and humor. She couldn't have been more than 25, with fair skin that suggested she hadn't spent her life under the harsh western sun. When one of the cowboys at her table made a crude comment, she handled it with a sharp wit that made the other players laugh while firmly putting the man in his place. "She's educated," Murphy continued, wiping down glasses with a stained towel. "Speaks proper English, can do figures in her head faster than most men with pencil and paper. Says she worked in a gambling house in San Francisco, but something tells me there's more to her story than that." Jake knocked back his whiskey and felt the burn slide down his throat. Why'd she come to a place like Willow Creek? Not exactly the opportunity capital of Colorado. Didn't say, and I didn't ask. Rule of the frontier. Everyone's got a past they're running from or toward. Long as she does her job and doesn't cause trouble, it's none of my business. As if sensing their conversation, Rose looked up from the card table and caught Jake's eye. For a moment, their gazes held across the smoky room, and Jake felt something stir in his chest. A feeling he hadn't experienced since Sarah Mitchell broke their engagement 2 years ago to marry a banker's son in Denver. Rose excused herself from the table and walked over to the bar, her movements fluid despite the crowded room. Up close, Jake could see she had a small scar above her left eyebrow and calloused fingers that spoke of hard work despite her refined appearance. "You must be Jake Morrison," she said, extending her hand. "I've heard quite a bit about you since I arrived. They say you run the biggest ranch in the valley." Jake shook her hand, surprised by her firm grip. "Just doing my part to keep food on the table. Rose Henderson, right? Murphy says you're from San Francisco." "Among other places," she replied with a smile that was both warm and guarded. "I hear you just returned from a cattle drive. That must be exhausting work." Before Jake could respond, the saloon doors burst open, and in walked Charles Brennan, the son of the town's mayor and a man Jake had never liked. Charles had inherited his father's political ambitions, but none of his common sense or work ethic. At 26, he spent most of his time gambling, drinking, and causing trouble for anyone he considered beneath his social station. Well, Charles said loudly, clearly already several drinks into his evening. "If it isn't our local cattle baron, consorting with the hired help." The saloon grew quieter as conversations stopped and heads turned toward the confrontation. Jake felt his jaw tighten, but before he could respond, Rose stepped forward. "Mr. Brennan," she said coolly, "I believe you still owe the house $12 from last night's poker game. Perhaps you'd like to settle that debt before making any more colourful observations about your fellow customers." Charles's face reddened, whether from alcohol or embarrassment Jake couldn't tell. "Listen here, you little—" "Charles." Jake's voice cut through the tension like a knife. He stepped beside Rose, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. "Maybe it's time you headed home. Your father's got enough to worry about without you starting trouble in Murphy's place." The standoff lasted several long seconds, with most of the saloon watching to see what would happen. Charles was known for his temper, but he was also smart enough to know that Jake Morrison had friends throughout the territory, men who wouldn't take kindly to anyone disrespecting one of their own. Finally, Charles stepped back, though his eyes remained hostile. "This isn't over, Morrison. You and your new friend here might want to remember that some people in this town have long memories." After Charles stumbled back out into the night, the normal sounds of the saloon gradually resumed. Rose turned to Jake with a look of genuine gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "I could have handled him myself, but I appreciate the support. Men like Charles think they can push people around because their daddy has a title," Jake replied. "Someone needs to remind them that respect is earned, not inherited." Rose studied his face for a moment, as if trying to read something in his expression. "You're not what I expected when people describe the local rancher." "What did you expect? Someone harder, I suppose. Less willing to stand up for a saloon girl he'd just met." She paused, then added, "Buy me a drink and tell me what's really troubling you tonight. And don't say nothing. I've dealt cards long enough to read faces, and yours is telling quite a story." Jake found himself sitting at a corner table with Rose, 2 glasses of whiskey between them and the rest of Murphy's saloon, fading into background noise. The oil lamps cast flickering shadows across her face as she listened to him explain his impossible situation. "So let me understand this correctly," Rose said, leaning forward slightly. "You have 6 weeks to either marry a stranger in Denver or lose everything your family has built over 40 years. "That's about the size of it," Jake replied, running his hand through his dark hair. "Charles Weatherby holds all the cards. He knows we can't raise $8,000, and he's banking on the fact that I won't sacrifice the ranch and 12 families just to avoid an arranged marriage." Rose swirled the whiskey in her glass, her green eyes thoughtful. "What do you know about this Victoria Weatherby?" "Nothing really. Father says she's educated back east, 24 years old, and looking for a husband. That's it." Jake took a sip of his drink. "For all I know, she could be as eager for this arrangement as her father is. Maybe she sees it as her ticket to adventure in the Wild West. Or maybe she's as trapped as you are," Rose suggested. "Wealthy families back east don't usually have trouble finding suitors for their daughters. If Charles Weatherby is using her as collateral for a business debt, there might be more to this story." Jake hadn't considered that possibility. In his experience, rich people generally got what they wanted when they wanted it. The idea that Victoria might be suffering under her father's demands the same way he was under his circumstances offered little comfort, but did add another layer of complexity to an already difficult decision. "Tell me something," Rose said, changing the subject. "If money weren't an issue, what would you want your life to look like?" The question caught Jake off guard. He'd been so focused on survival and responsibility that he hadn't thought about his own desires in months. "I suppose I'd want to expand the ranch, maybe add a few hundred head of cattle, build a proper house instead of the old cabin my grandfather threw together, find someone to share it all with eventually." "Someone you chose yourself," Rose added. "Exactly." Jake met her eyes across the table. "What about you? What brought a woman like you to a place like Willow Creek?" Rose was quiet for a long moment, and Jake wondered if he'd overstepped. Finally she spoke. "I was engaged to a man in San Francisco, Jonathan Hartwell. He was a banker, well-respected, came from a good family, everything my parents wanted for me. What happened? I discovered he was embezzling money from his clients, mostly working-class families who trusted him with their savings. When I confronted him, he said I could either keep quiet and become his wife as planned, or he'd make sure I was ruined socially and financially." Rose's voice was steady, but Jake could hear the pain beneath it. "I chose a third option. I gathered evidence and turned him into the authorities." "Good for you," Jake said, meaning it. "The scandal destroyed him, but it destroyed me too. His family had connections, money, influence. They made sure everyone knew I was the woman who betrayed her fiancé. No decent family would associate with me after that." Rose finished her whiskey in one swallow. "So I took what little money I had and headed somewhere I could start over." Jake found himself admiring her courage. "That took real strength, doing what was right even when it cost you everything." "Did it, though?" Rose asked, a slight smile playing at her lips. "Because sitting here tonight, talking with an honest man who stands up for people, I'm thinking maybe I ended up exactly where I was supposed to be." Their conversation was interrupted by Murphy approaching their table, his expression concerned. "Jake, you might want to know. Charles Brennan was just outside talking to some of his friends. Heard him saying something about making sure the uppity rancher and his saloon girl learned their place. Jake felt a familiar anger rise in his chest. Charles was the type who couldn't let a slight go, especially when it happened in front of witnesses. How many friends? Looked like 4 or 5, Murphy replied. Nothing you couldn't handle. But they were all armed and all drunk. Might be better to wait them out. Rose stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. Or we could solve 2 problems at once. Both men looked at her in confusion. She turned to Jake, her green eyes bright with sudden inspiration. You need to avoid an arranged marriage, and Charles Brennan needs to see that his intimidation tactics won't work. What if we gave the whole town something to talk about? What do you mean? Jake asked, though something in her tone made his pulse quicken. Rose stepped closer to him, close enough that he could smell her perfume. Something floral and expensive that seemed out of place in the rough saloon. What if Jake Morrison was already spoken for? What if he was courting someone right here in Willow Creek? The idea was so unexpected that Jake almost laughed. You're suggesting we pretend to be engaged? I'm suggesting we let people draw their own conclusions, Rose replied. Charles Weatherby can't force you to marry his daughter if you're already committed to someone else. And Charles Brennan will think twice about harassing a woman who's under the protection of Jake Morrison. Murphy stroked his red beard thoughtfully. It's not the craziest idea I've heard. This town loves its gossip, and nothing travels faster than news about romance. Jake stared at Rose, trying to process what she was suggesting. It was risky for both of them. If the truth came out, it could make their situations worse. But it was also the first plan he'd heard that didn't require him to sacrifice either his freedom or his family's legacy. There's just one problem, he said slowly. To make it convincing, we'd have to make it public. And Charles Brennan is probably still outside waiting for us. Rose smiled, and for the first time since he'd entered the saloon, Jake felt hope stirring in his chest. Then let's give him something to see, she said, reaching up to cup his face with her hand. Kiss me, Jake Morrison. Make it look like you mean it. Jake hesitated for only a moment before leaning down to meet Rose's lips. What was meant to be a performance for the watching crowd became something entirely unexpected. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but as Rose's hand slid from his cheek to the back of his neck, something shifted between them. When they finally broke apart, Jake found himself looking into her eyes with genuine surprise at the emotions stirring within him. The saloon had gone completely quiet. Every patron, from the poker players to old Pete at the piano, was staring at them with expressions ranging from shock to delighted amusement. Murphy grinned broadly behind the bar, clearly pleased with the unexpected entertainment. Well, Rose said softly, her cheeks flushed but her voice steady. I'd say that was convincing. Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. What had started as a practical solution to their mutual problems had awakened something he hadn't expected. The way Rose had felt in his arms, the genuine warmth in her eyes when she looked at him. It was nothing like the calculated arrangement Charles Weatherby was offering. Let's go, Jake said, offering Rose his arm. Might as well make this official. They walked toward the batwing doors, aware that every eye in Murphy's saloon was following their movement. Jake pushed through first, then held the doors open for Rose to step into the cool October evening. As Murphy had predicted, Charles Brennan and 4 of his friends were lounging against the hitching post across the street, clearly waiting for them to emerge. Well, well, Charles called out, pushing himself away from the post with exaggerated casualness. Look what we have here, the great Jake Morrison, making a public spectacle of himself with hired entertainment. Jake felt Rose's hand tighten slightly on his arm, but her voice remained calm when she spoke. Mr. Brennan, I believe we've already established that your debts are more interesting than your opinions. Charles's friends snickered at the comeback, which only made his face redden further. Jake recognized them as young men from town, whose main occupations seemed to involve drinking, gambling, and looking for trouble. None of them were serious threats individually, but together and drunk, they could be dangerous. You think you're clever, don't you? Charles stepped into the street, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. Both of you, acting like you're better than the rest of us. We're not acting, Jake replied evenly, stepping slightly in front of Rose. Some people earn respect through their actions. Others demand it through intimidation. The difference usually becomes pretty clear pretty quickly. The tension in the street was thick enough to cut. Several other townspeople had emerged from nearby buildings, drawn by the sound of raised voices. Jake recognized Doc Williams, the postmaster Tom Fletcher, and Mary Chen, who who ran the general store with her husband. Word of this confrontation would spread through Willow Creek faster than a prairie fire. "You want to settle this like men?" Charles asked, his voice slurring slightly from alcohol. "I want to take my lady home," Jake replied, deliberately emphasizing the possessive term. "But if you're determined to make trouble, we can discuss it when you're sober enough to remember the conversation." Rose squeezed Jake's arm gently, a silent signal. When he looked down at her, she stood on her tiptoes and whispered in his ear, just loud enough for the watching crowd to hear. "Don't let him provoke you, darling. He's not worth it." The endearment sent a surprising warmth through Jake's chest, even though he knew it was part of their performance. But the way she said it, the protective concern in her voice, felt genuine rather than calculated. Charles heard the whispered words, and his expression grew even uglier. "Darling, is it? How touching. I wonder what your father would think, Morrison, about you taking up with a saloon girl instead of making a proper marriage." "My father," Jake said carefully, "raised me to judge people by their character, not their circumstances. Something your father apparently forgot to teach you." Before Charles could respond, a new voice cut through the night air. "That's enough." Sheriff Tom Bradley emerged from the shadows beside the jail, his badge glinting in the light from Murphy's saloon. A man in his 50s with grey hair and steady eyes, Bradley had been keeping the peace in Willow Creek for over a decade. He commanded respect from both law-abiding citizens and troublemakers alike. "Charles," the sheriff continued, "you and your friends have been drinking. Go home before you do something you'll regret when you sober up." "This isn't any of your business, Sheriff," Charles protested, though his hand moved away from his gun. "Preventing trouble is exactly my business," Bradley replied, "and I can see trouble brewing from a mile away. Jake, Miss Henderson, I suggest you folks head home as well. The night air seems to be bringing out the worst in people." Jake nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Sheriff. Rose, shall we?" As they walked away from the confrontation, Jake could hear Charles muttering angry words to his friends, but none of them seemed inclined to pursue the matter further with Sheriff Bradley watching. The crowd of onlookers began to disperse, though Jake was certain they'd all be talking about what they'd witnessed before the night was through. "Where exactly are we going?" Rose asked quietly as they made their way down Main Street. "I should probably escort you back to wherever you're staying," Jake replied. "Make sure you're safe. I have a room above Murphy's saloon," Rose said. "It's not much, but it's clean and private." They walked in comfortable silence for a few moments before Rose spoke again. "That went better than I expected. By tomorrow morning, everyone in town will be talking about Jake Morrison's new romance." "Is that what we're calling it?" Jake asked, surprised by his own boldness. Rose stopped walking and turned to face him, studying his expression in the moonlight. "What would you call it?" Jake looked down at her, remembering the way she'd felt when he kissed her, the way she'd stood up to Charles Brennan without flinching, the courage she'd shown in leaving her old life behind to start fresh. "I'm not sure yet," he said honestly, "but I'd like to find out." Rose smiled, and this time there was nothing calculated or guarded about it. "So would I, Jake Morrison. So would I." As they continued toward the saloon, neither of them noticed Charles Brennan watching from the shadows across the street, his expression dark with anger and determination. 3 weeks had passed since that night at Murphy's saloon, and Jake Morrison found himself thinking less about arranged marriages and more about the woman who had unexpectedly entered his life. What had begun as a practical solution to mutual problems had blossomed into something neither of them had anticipated. Rose had proven herself to be far more than just a saloon girl looking for work. She possessed a sharp mind for business, helping Murphy reorganize his bookkeeping and increase profits by 20% in just 2 weeks. More importantly to Jake, she had shown genuine interest in the ranch, riding out with him to check on cattle and asking thoughtful questions about everything from breeding practices to water rights. This morning, Jake sat across from his father and Maria at the breakfast table, a telegram from Denver lying unopened beside his coffee cup. They all knew what it contained: Charles Weatherby's demand for a final answer about the marriage proposal. "You've been different these past weeks," Samuel observed, studying his son's face. "Happier, I think. More settled." "Rose is a good woman, Papa," Jake replied. "She's intelligent, brave, and she makes me want to be a better man. I know what people say about her working at the saloon, but she's got more dignity and honor than half the so-called respectable women in this territory." Maria smiled warmly. "Love is like the sunrise, mijo. It cannot be hidden or faked. When I see you with this Rose, I see a man who has found his heart. Jake picked up the telegram and broke the wax seal. As expected, it was from Charles Weatherby, demanding an immediate response about the marriage to Victoria. If Jake declined, full payment would be due within the week, or legal proceedings would begin to seize the ranch. What does it say? Samuel asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. The same thing we expected. Marriage or foreclosure. Jake folded the telegram and set it aside. But I've made my decision. I'm going to ride to Denver tomorrow and tell Charles Weatherby in person that I'm not available for his arrangement. I've found someone I want to marry, and it's not his daughter. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Son, I admire your courage and I like Rose very much. But are you prepared for what this means? We'll lose the ranch. The men will lose their jobs. Everything your grandfather built will be gone. Before Jake could respond, the sound of hoofbeats approaching the house drew their attention. Through the window, they could see Rose riding up on a borrowed horse from Murphy's stable, her green dress traded for practical riding clothes she'd purchased from Mary Chen's general store. Jake stepped onto the porch to meet her, and the serious expression on her face told him she had news. Jake, she said, dismounting quickly, I've been talking to some of the traveling merchants who come through Murphy's place. There's something you need to know about Charles Weatherby. Samuel and Maria joined them on the porch as Rose continued. A whiskey drummer from Denver told me that Weatherby's shipping business is in serious financial trouble. He owes money to creditors all over Colorado, and he's been calling in old debts to try to stay afloat. That doesn't surprise me, Jake replied. Desperate men do desperate things. There's more, Rose said. The drummer also mentioned that Victoria Weatherby has been seen around Denver with a young lawyer named William Foster. They're apparently quite serious about each other, but her father refuses to approve the match because Foster doesn't have enough money to help with the family's debts. Jake felt a spark of hope. You think she might be as unwilling as I am? I think we should find out, Rose replied. What if we went to Denver together? What if we offered Charles Weatherby a different kind of solution? The next morning found Jake and Rose on the stage to Denver, their plan both simple and risky. Instead of trying to fight Charles Weatherby's demands, they would offer him something he wanted even more than a strategic marriage, a way to save face and solve his financial problems without sacrificing his daughters. Happiness, Denver in 1888 was a growing city, its streets bustling with miners, merchants, and businessmen drawn by Colorado's silver boom. The Weatherby mansion sat in the fashionable Capitol Hill district, its Victorian architecture and manicured grounds speaking of wealth and status. Charles Weatherby received them in his study, his surprise at Rose's presence evident in his raised eyebrows and disapproving frown. He was a man in his 50s with greying hair and the soft appearance of someone who had lived comfortably but was now feeling the pressure of financial strain. Mr. Morrison, he said formally, I trust you've come to discuss the terms of your engagement to my daughter. Actually, sir, I've come to discuss an alternative arrangement, Jake replied, one that might serve both our families better. Jake laid out their proposal carefully. Rose had done research during their journey, learning that several Eastern investment groups were looking for opportunities in Colorado cattle ranching. If Charles would forgive the Morrison family debt, Jake would use his connections throughout the territory to help Weatherby secure contracts for shipping cattle to Eastern markets. The commissions from such an arrangement could potentially earn far more than $8,000 over time. Furthermore, Rose added, this would allow your daughter to marry for love rather than financial necessity. I understand she has feelings for a young lawyer named William Foster. Charles's face reddened. You've been investigating my family's private affairs? We've been looking for a solution that serves everyone's interests, Jake replied calmly. Your daughter's happiness, your business needs, and my family's survival. Before Charles could respond, the study door opened and a young woman entered. Victoria Weatherby was indeed beautiful, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes. But Jake felt nothing beyond polite appreciation. She carried herself with the confidence of someone well-educated and strong-willed. Father, she said firmly, I couldn't help but overhear. Are these the people offering an alternative to your plan to auction me off to save the business? Victoria, you will not speak of family matters in such terms, Charles warned. Why not? She replied. It's the truth. You want to force me to marry a stranger to pay your debts, while the man I actually love sits in a law office across town, believing I don't care enough to fight for our relationship. Jake exchanged glances with Rose, then spoke directly to Victoria. "Miss Weatherby, if you're willing to support our proposal to your father, I give you my word that Rose and I will do everything in our power to make sure you're free to marry whomever you choose." Victoria looked between Jake and Rose, then at her father's increasingly uncomfortable expression. "Mr. Morrison, you have yourself a deal." The negotiation took most of the afternoon, but by evening, they had reached an agreement. Charles would forgive the Morrison debt in exchange for Jake's help securing shipping contracts throughout Colorado. Victoria would be free to marry William Foster, and Jake would return to Willow Creek with Rose as his intended bride. As they prepared to leave Denver the next morning, Rose took Jake's arm and smiled up at him. "So, Mr. Morrison, are you ready to make an honest woman of me?" Jake laughed, pulling her close for a kiss that was no longer about performance or practicality. "Miss Henderson, I thought you'd never ask." 6 months later, the entire town of Willow Creek gathered to celebrate the wedding of Jake Morrison and Rose Henderson. Murphy's Saloon provided the refreshments, Maria Santos made the wedding cake, and Sheriff Bradley performed the ceremony. Even Charles Brennan attended, though he spent most of the evening sulking in a corner. The Morrison Ranch thrived under the new shipping arrangements, and Jake built the proper house he'd always dreamed of. Rose proved to be not only a loving wife, but also a shrewd business partner, helping expand their operations throughout Colorado Territory. As for Victoria Weatherby, she married her lawyer the following spring, and Charles Weatherby's shipping business recovered enough to make him one of Denver's most successful merchants. Sometimes, Jake reflected as he watched Rose teaching their young son to ride his first pony. The best solutions to impossible problems came from the most unexpected places. What had begun as a desperate attempt to avoid an arranged marriage had led him to the greatest love of his life.